Hello, everybody. This is John Gamache. I'm the Associate Director of the Woodwell Film Festival. We're very excited today to continue a conversation that began at the 33rd Annual Woodwell Film Festival this summer. There was just so much to talk about at the festival that we couldn't fit it all in one Q&A. So we really wanted to get these two wonderful people together to continue their conversation, expand a little bit about the work they do both on the screen and in the science community. And we're very excited to be able to make that happen today. So I'm going to introduce to you now Will Parrinello, who's the filmmaker from the documentary film Water is Life, which screened at the film festival this summer, and Marcia Macedo from the Woodwell Research Center in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. I'm just going to let them go ahead and kick it off and kind of pick up where they left. But please, if you two can, kind of further introduce yourself, give a little bit of a background of your work, the film, the work you do at Woodwell, and have some fun. And we'll see you on the other side of this.
Thanks, John.
Yep.
Nice to be here. Thanks for joining me, Marcia. So I'm Will Parrinello, and I'm the filmmaker of Water for Life, as John said. I've been producing documentary films for more than 30 years with my filmmaking partner, John Antonelli at the Mill Valley Film Group. We've made more than 125 films about environmental activists who are associated with the Goldman Environmental Prize. And that's how I found the three protagonists in my film, Water for Life. And so I guess Water for Life, I should give it a thumbnail sketch. Water for Life explores the collision of water rights, indigenous beliefs, and resource extraction through the lives of three Latin American community leaders. The right to clean water is a global issue, but in Latin America, it has become a matter of life and death. Marcia, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marcia Macedo. I am a scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center and director of our water program. I'm an ecologist by training, so I work a lot in the tropics. I've been working in the Amazon for almost 30 years, 25 years. And I spend a lot of time in Brazil. I'm Brazilian American, do a lot of work both in Cape Cod and in Brazil, looking at how land use and climate change affect the water cycle. So this film was really right in line with the kinds of things that I like to think about, the challenge of managing environmental change and also ensuring that we have water and enough water in the places that we need them to sustain life. So yeah, I'll pass it to you if you want to give, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about the film or.
Sure. Yeah, let me describe our protagonists. Water for Life tells the story of three, I like to think of them as ordinary individuals who have had to take extraordinary measures to protect their water, their ancestral land, and literally their very lives from multinational corporations who are trying to take the resources that are on their land, typically water-based. The three individuals are Berta Cáceres, who is a Lenca indigenous leader in Honduras, Francisco Pineda, who's a subsistence farmer in El Salvador, and Alberto Curamil, an indigenous Mapuche chief in Chile. You know, they all knew what lay ahead if they allowed large-scale industry to come in and take their water, which was going to be used for mining, hydroelectric projects, or large-scale industrial agriculture, you know, both foodstuffs, but also timber agriculture. And for example, in Chile, they were cutting down the native Araucania trees, which are, it's the name of the region. It's also the tree. It's a type of pine tree, and it's indigenous to the area, sacred to the people. And those trees can survive on small amounts of water. And the trees that were being planted there, eucalyptus, you know, drink up the water in the water table. And they'd been suffering from years of drought. So it was, it was vital to protect those lands. And so, you know, in all three stories, the people did not really have true free, prior, and informed consent, which are three hallmarks by which people are supposed to be informed if a project is going to be put together on their property. And it's something that's in the Constitution, and it's something that this is a UN convention that each of these countries agreed to, free, prior, and informed consent. And typically the companies, go in and they do some sort of an environmental impact assessment plan, but they don't really do a proper plan. And because there's so much money at stake, the governments are being corrupted by the corporations that are coming in and trying to put these projects together. So that's kind of a little bit of a thumbnail sketch on the background of the stories. What do you think? What do you have any questions, Marcia, or?
Well, I mean, I was really taken. I think I mentioned this to you during the film festival. As I said, I've been thinking about these issues a bit, but and I was in the audience when Bertha got her Goldman Environmental Prize in DC. I know that there's multiple award ceremonies, and was very taken with her story and with her sort of passion for making a difference under very dangerous situations. I mean, she already had threats on her life, and even at that time. And then I was, of course, very sad to hear that she was actually ultimately assassinated. And I guess that story is repeated again and again in so many situations. People fighting against all odds for the things that they believe in, for their land rights, for their rights to access to water, etc. I don't know what the question is, I guess, but I mean, you got to know these three individuals very, very well and very personally, and I just wonder if you could say a little bit about what it takes to have that kind of conviction and what it was like to know them and to learn their stories.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great jumping off place. I mean, yeah, I should say all three of the protagonists in our film are Goldman Environmental Prize laureates. If the audience is unaware of the prize, the Goldman Prize, I think is going to be 36 or 37 years old this year. And every year they recognize 6 grassroots environmental activists from around the world who have achieved a seemingly unachievable goal. And it's huge, right? The prize recipients are brought to San Francisco for an award ceremony that takes place at the Opera House. And then 2 days later in Washington, D.C., I think they're doing it at the Kennedy Center now, and they receive $225,000 to go towards their work. And, a lot of times these are people who are subsistence farmers. They're living a very simple life. They don't own their own home. They've never owned a car. So this kind of financial support from the prize is really important. And in the case of Alberto Curamil, for example, he stopped two hydroelectric projects from being built on his sacred river. But the government then trumped up charges against him for having robbed a savings and loan, and he didn't rob the savings and loan. And the only evidence they had was an anonymous phone call from someone. And the prize actually was instrumental in him not being incarcerated. The judge said, like early on in the process, like the pre-trial proceedings, that, she hoped to put him away for 50 years. And this was, on an anonymous phone call, no serious evidence. So the prize was able to help with his legal defense fund, which was really important. And he did not go to jail as a result. But to your question, these I described in my introduction, these are ordinary people who have taken extraordinary measures. And I don't know that there really are ordinary people, right? But in a sense, I mean, they're living life on the earth. Everyone involved is living subsistence farming lifestyle. And when their water and their land was threatened, they took up the cause. And they're all grassroots leaders who created a movement within their communities that led to them creating local movements, regional movements, and it eventually got, national and international attention. And so, what I've seen in making films about Goldman Prize winner for 21 years is that the way to affect positive change in the world, you know, socially and politically, is through grassroots movements, that you can create change. You know, we're coming up on a presidential election in the United States, and we're all very concerned about the outcome, no matter which side we're on. But the reality is, how much impact do we really have on national politics? But on local politics, we really do have a say. And I think the thing that each of my protagonists would tell us, you know, as citizens of planet Earth, is that we need to stand up for what we believe in, for what we care about. And they would say, if I were to tell them and I see them as heroic, they would say, but we're doing something that you would do if this happened to you. If a corporation came in and was taking away your water and your land and your ability to live your life, you would stand up and fight. And I say, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think I might flee. I don't think I am that brave. But, you know, what I know is that by working with these people, they certainly have made me want to do more. And what I do is tell stories. And that's why I chose to take these 3 stories on. And it took 12 years to make the film. And, you know, part of the reason it took 12 years is that we made a commitment to follow the trajectory of these stories till a positive conclusion. We didn't know necessarily there would be a positive conclusion, but I felt pretty confident because I saw how strong these individuals were and how strong their commitment was to fighting these fights. And I also thought that because they built this grassroots support, if God forbid something were to happen to one of them, others would pick up the mantle. And, you know, again, I go back to Alberto Curamil. He was incarcerated and he received the Goldman Prize while he was incarcerated. And his then 17-year-old daughter, Belen Curamil, came to San Francisco and went to Washington, D.C. to receive the prize. And when we met her, when we first went to make the film for the Goldman Prize, which was in 2018, you know, she was not unlike a lot of 17-year-old girls, right? She respected her parents. She had a great knowledge of her culture, her indigenous background, but she was 17 years old. And we saw her in 6 months become a very strong, mature young woman because she was given the task of having to represent her father on the international stage. And I have to say, when I watched the film, I get emotional every time I see the film at different times, but when I see Belen accepting the Goldman Prize and making this incredible speech and talking about the meaning of the earth to the Mapuche people and to indigenous people in general, I get tears in my eyes. And when we went back to film after Alberto had been exonerated of those, you know, of those crimes that he didn't, you know, that he didn't perpetuate, she said, you know, I think I want to just go back to being a young woman. I'm not sure I want to be a spokesperson anymore. And we weren't disappointed and we weren't surprised, and we kind of respected that. But after we were there for a week, she didn't really care to be filmed. But after we were there for a week, she asked, you know, if she could do an interview again because she wanted to give her thoughts and feelings. And since that time, she has been training to become like a spiritual healer. You know, it's the analogy I give to North Americans would be like a medicine woman, right? A healer, a medicinal healer, and she'll be really good at that. I know that's and that's a wonderful thing, and her parents are really proud of her having done that. So I think I answered your question. I went in a lot of different places there and didn't exactly talk about Berta or Francisco Pineda, but
No, I agree. I was very moved by that scene of I'm blanking on her name, but
Belen.
Belen accepting the prize and just clearly kind of stepping into this role of being a leader and an activist when she felt like she needed to. Gave me goosebumps. Also brought tears to my eyes, and I haven't known her. I didn't watch her grow up, so it was very well done.
Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned Berta. I don't know if another question comes to mind about Berta or not. I mean, I'm happy to talk about. that, or whatever, whatever else comes to mind.
Well, I think one of the I often, I give talks a lot, and I talk about sort of deforestation in the Amazon and how the rainfall regimes and the fire regimes are changing as a result of climate change and land use change, and these problems feel so. I mean, they're changing around the world, right? Fire we see everywhere, very much related to the water cycle. Uh, big problems, and often at the end of a talk that I give, I get the question of, what gives you hope, like why do you keep doing this work, right? It feels so hopeless sometimes. And I have to say that Francisco's, I mean, all of these stories gave me hope in a sense, right? It just obvious, like you were saying, the strength to do what needs to be done, even though it seems impossible, is so clear in each of these people and in all of the Golden Prize winners. But the story of the end of the story of Francisco Pineda was especially surprising. I wasn't aware of how things had resolved there, although I was aware of his story. I don't know if we should give it away to the audience, or what do you think?
I guess I'll say this, I'll answer I'll address what you're bringing up with the idea of hope. I mean, two of the main motivations in making this film. Number one, we wanted to give people hope, because we were finding, as we were taking the Goldman Prize films out into schools, and because they're inspirational to high school and college students, but as we were taking them out, we were finding that there's a great bit, I mean, understandably, a great deal of despair and lack of hope, and feeling like we're really kind of doomed. And although the crisis is undeniable and we can't bury our heads in the sand or deny the challenges we've created for ourselves, every year, as I mentioned a minute ago, every year I meet 6 people who are creating positive change in the world, and I see how small movements lead to big change. So that's why we wanted to tell these stories, but we wanted to tell them in a way that was real. It's easy to put a hero on a pedestal, and it's also easy for the public to have this sort of stereotype of the activist with the bullhorn. But we wanted to show a life in full, and to show the family life and the community life, and to show the cost that the family has to pay for the activism, because they do have to give up some of their life. They do have to give up their loved ones' time, and they're also brought into those struggles and into those battles. And so that can be challenging. But the point was that, by taking action on something that you believe in and you're passionate about, you can create positive change. And it's been rewarding taking the film out. As we've screened the film for high school and university students, it is incredibly inspirational to people. So our goal is being fulfilled. And the second reason was that the threats, the impunity, the violence perpetuated against environmental defenders is off the charts. Global Witness started tracking this, I think, in 2010 or 2012. And since that time, something like 2,300 individuals have been murdered, environmental defenders, close to 200 alone in the past year. And a majority of those are in Latin America. So the exploitation and impunity that you see in our 3 stories is emblematic of what's happening in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific archipelago, and even now in North America. So that was the reasoning behind it. And we began the film with thinking it was a film only about Francisco Pineda, who is a subsistence farmer from El Salvador. Francisco does have indigenous blood. His mother was Lenca, but there had been a genocide of indigenous people in the 1930s, when there was a socialist movement and kind of a land reform, land rights movement in El Salvador. And since that time, I mean, not only were a lot of people murdered, and if 30,000 were reported, the numbers were probably, 10 or 15,000 more than that is what's predicted. So he doesn't really identify with being indigenous, but he's very connected to the land. And his story was remarkable because he was part of a movement to ban mining, and it came into being at the time of a presidential election, and the sitting conservative president, who was in favor of mining, saw he was terming out, and he saw that the candidate from his party was behind in the polls to the liberal candidate. And so he said, I'm going to ban mining. And he did by presidential decree. So then this US Mining Corporation sued the government of El Salvador in the World Bank Tribunal. And if you get money from the World Bank and you don't adhere to international trade policy, then you're liable to be sued. So a $350 million suit. And then within 1 year, 3 of Francisco's associates in the anti-mining movement were assassinated. And we thought, this is a really powerful, powerful story. And the goal was to get the government, to get Congress to pass binding legislation to ban all mining, right? But that took years and years to finally come to fruition. And so we decided to add 2 other stories, because after working on the film for 5 years, we initially were able to raise money. National Geographic was our first funder. But after 5 years, El Salvador had kind of fallen off the map geopolitically. People didn't really care about it anymore, and we were having a really difficult time with funding. And so my filmmaking partner, John Antonelli, who was an advisor on the project, he didn't actually work on it, was able to have the big picture. And he said, you need to put together 3 stories. And then you show, as I mentioned a minute ago, these patterns of exploitation and impunity that are emblematic of stories that we've seen happening around the world. And then it was a no-brainer, like, to take it to the natural conclusion. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Like
I was blown away by, it never occurred to me that a country could ban mining. We see, I've worked a bit I have colleagues who work in the Peruvian Amazon, and the gold mining there has just exploded, and it's completely out of control, and it feels like an impossible problem, right? And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that Peru is going to ban mining anytime soon, but I just, it was inspiring to me to see that such a final solution could come from this work.
No, it's kind of remarkable, and there's fear there now, because President Bukele, who has just taken an unprecedented second term, right? He's kind of changed the constitution, because you're not allowed to have 2 consecutive terms in El Salvador. Well, he has, and he's consolidated power. He's dismissed Supreme Court judges and appointed his own. When he wants legislation passed that the Congress doesn't enact, he goes in to Congress, like with an armed cadre, sort of to pose the threat. And now we're hearing reports that there are Peruvian and Chinese mining interests that are there in the region, specifically in the state of Cabañas, where there's quite a bit of gold under the earth. And the president has been making noise about wanting to change that anti-mining legislation, trying to pressure Congress to change that. Nothing's happened yet, but we're concerned, right? We're worried about that, and worried about safety of environmental defenders now in El Salvador. It's a very complicated political situation there.
On the theme of power, I was curious about one thing, that a thread that you kind of pulled through all 3 stories was, not just didn't start at the beginning of the people's stories, but kind of further back. I'm not expressing this well, but you looked further back to the root causes of some of the power imbalances in each of these regions, right? And some of that was rooted in kind of political maneuverings, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even further back. And so I was just curious about why you chose to do that, to make that point, that that yes, there's the mining companies and the local people that are kind of fighting for their rights in this moment now. There's that power imbalance, but that the root cause goes further back.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It seemed important for both the audience, who may not remember the politics, and particularly for a younger audience, to understand that the United States, Canada, China, Australia isn't part of our story, but I'll put Australia in there because they could have been part of the story. Are these developed world countries that we like to think of as doing good in the world, but we're perpetuating the kind of political and social and economic, often driven by economic needs, the kinds of changes within governments and regimes that we want to see. And so it felt really important to talk about, for example, in Chile, we backed Pinochet, who was responsible for, a coup, a military coup. He was a general, unseating Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president, who was much more liberal and leaning towards a socialist, presidency and policies and so forth. And it didn't suit our needs. And the United States, with the CIA, undermined and supported that. And in El Salvador, it wasn't so much that the government was doing something in particular, but of course we go back to, I described the World Bank, which is a world body politic, and how economic pressure forces a government to make changes. And, El Salvador chose to stand up, but a lot of countries have to cave under those circumstances. But of course, there was a civil war there. And I alluded earlier to the conservative president who banned mining because he saw that the liberal president was winning power. Well, that conservative president represents Arena, and the Arena party was a party during a time of a civil war in the 70s and 80s in El Salvador, which was again based around a land movement, socialist tendencies. And Ronald Reagan did not want to see communism in any form taking hold. And so we backed this conservative movement that was putting down a liberal movement to grab hold of power. And it was definitely a people power movement, the FMLN against the Arena party. And there were death squads, and estimates are that close to 70,000 people were killed by these death squads that were part of the Arena party, which was part of the army of the government, and that was supported by the United States. And then in Honduras, President Zelaya, who was a democratically elected president, who again was working with indigenous people on land reform issues, and he was also working on minimum wage and public health and education, and again, leaning towards what was described as a more socialist government, was brought down in a coup. And unfortunately, it was when President Obama, we like to think that it's only during a conservative presidency that these things happen, a conservative presidency in the United States. But President Obama was in office. And at first, after the coup, he made a public statement that, the democratically elected president must be recognized. But within, I think, 48 or 72 hours, Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State, said it's really not in the US interest to be involved in the politics of another country. And there was just this sort of doublespeak political machinations that were taking place because the power elite in Honduras didn't want to see this kind of liberal presidency. And, the United States has military bases there. I mean, it's the original banana republic, right? Honduras. So it's complicated. And so that's a long-winded answer, but it just seemed really important that we give context for our own roles, because I'd say a third motivation in making the film was to try to get viewers to understand what our government and what corporations that we may be investing in, whether that's directly through stock that we own or through mutual funds, in terms of being invested in certain industries, that we understand what we're doing and we start demanding of our political leaders and of our corporate leaders the kind of good civil action that we would want to see taking place in our own country or anywhere in the world. It's easy to kind of look the other way when it's not our own country, our own backyard. But when we know that our government is involved in some of these governmental upheavals, and then I would hope that we would take a different perspective and a different look at it.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the work that you do that's related to the work in the film, and maybe you can just give us, give us one case study, one example, because I think it's meaningful for the audience to hear how you see what I'm describing, that what our film is showing, it's a harbinger of other things that are happening around the world. So maybe you can share a story with us so we know a little bit more about your work.
Okay. I'd say probably the place that I've worked the longest and that I can see some parallels is the southeastern Amazon, the Xingu Basin. So it's the easternmost watershed of the Amazon Basin. Um, this area that's the headwaters of the Xingu River, and was also one of the first indigenous lands that was recognized by the government back in 1961. So there were indigenous communities who were contacted for the first time by colonial powers, of course, as a road was going through, right? And it's the usual story of um, uh, disease spread and population kind of collapse in some places, and that sort of moment inspired the Villas Boas brothers um, to help create some legal framework for recognizing the traditional extent of indigenous peoples' lands. And this is the first of many. I mean, the Brazilian government has recognized, oh, I don't know the number of reserves, but it's about a quarter of the protected forests in the Amazon are managed, and the traditional lands of indigenous peoples. And so the people in the Xingu Indigenous Territory um, were the first. And the way that protected area was designated was a bit different than the process is today, but it's a very large block of land by U.S. national park standards. It's huge. It's a 2.4 million hectare territory, but all of the headwaters were left outside of the park boundaries, because we don't think in terms of water and how it flows. And fast forward 40 years, and you start having not even maybe 20 years, you start having deforestation for land speculation and cattle ranching. People start moving into the region, and then that land starts getting consolidated into large scale agricultural production. So mostly soybeans for export, some beef for export, eventually soybeans and maize, but like industrial agriculture. And all of that is draining into the indigenous land. And so that for me set up I started working there because I was very interested in just how quickly everything was changing, and what are the repercussions of having these waters flowing into the reserve. I mean, we haven't actually been able to measure it, but thinking about pesticides that might be and herbicides that might be affecting fish and people living downstream, but also the hydrological cycle, right? If you remove large blocks of forest, not to get too technical, but if you remove large blocks of forest in this region, you actually change how much water is recycled back to the atmosphere. And if enough of that happens in the region, you start to affect the rainfall cycle. So the onset of the rainy season after a very long dry season, and we're starting to see that happening today. So I can say that when I started working there in about 2006, there were almost no fires. It was almost impossible for the forest to burn because it was just too wet. So even if a fire kind of took off during the day, as soon as it hit dew point at night, it would go out. And now in the last 15, 20 years, we've started seeing regular occurrence of fires and some large wildfires, especially in dry years. And so again, forces from completely outside of the reserve, the people living there have nothing to do with climate change. They've contributed very little to the problem. And they're being affected by all of these pressures from outside. And so some of the work that we've been doing is trying to understand the climatic and human drivers of those changing fire regimes, and how to manage it, right? I think a lot of the we talk about climate change in terms of carbon a lot and greenhouse gas emissions, but most of the impacts that we feel as people are really around water, right? It's water scarcity or too much water, or it's water. And a lot of the mitigation and adaptation, not mitigation, but adaptation that we need to do in order to sort of manage these changes really has to do with water and fire management when water is becoming more scarce. And so yeah, there's lots of people that I could point to in the context of that scenario, but that's the example that comes to mind.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's great and
Yeah.
nicely described. I mean, yeah, it's chilling to see satellite images of the Amazon deforestation over a 5, 10, and 20-year period, right? It's overwhelming. And climate change is now impacting not only the rainforest, but the Pantanal, which is a wetland in Brazil. It's the
Yep.
largest wetland in the world, if I'm not wrong. You can correct me on that if that's not correct. But when a wetland is burning, the Pantanal is burning, it's hard to even comprehend, right? How that's even possible. It's time for us to do something different, I think. But I mean, I guess for me, a follow-up question would be, or a comment, and to have you comment on it would be, what I've seen with the protagonists in my film and dozens of other Goldman Environmental Prize laureates is that in, indigenous people and people of the earth, if they're not indigenous farmers and so forth, are living on the earth. They're living with the cycle of the earth. They understand how to care for the earth, and they're not over consuming. They're not polluting. They're not doing the things that are destroying the environment for the most part, when allowed to live their traditional lives, right? Their lifestyle. And not to overly romanticize that, but at the same time, it feels like there's something to be learned, because as the dominant societies, the consumer cultures, right? The gross domestic product and the idea that we have to create more and consume more each year has long passed the tipping point. We can no longer sustain this. The idea of looking to people like the indigenous people in the Chingu, or in the 3 countries where I've worked, or anywhere in the world, to look to their knowledge about how to live our lives in more balance, and the notion of consuming less and using less seems all important, but that's a tough message to get out into the world, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, we don't want to give up our stuff. But absolutely, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned but from the exchange, honestly. I mean, the world is changing so quickly. I think we need all forms of knowledge to figure out how to survive and kind of move forward in a productive and resilient way. Yeah, so I do think I've it's been very powerful to do research in this region, but and kind of bring the tools that I bring. I work with satellite images and water samples and whatnot, but then also to work with people who see the world in a different way and understand it in a different way, but it's just as valid, and it brings new insights when you kind of do that cross fertilization, cross thinking. I don't know how else to
Yeah.
say it. So
Yeah, no,
yeah,
that's
I
right.
think we need more of that, and we certainly need to support the people who've done the hard work of keeping natural ecosystems working, and that
Yeah,
includes, in and financing it, right, through I think of like the UN UNFCCC kind of frameworks, right, where we're trying to come up with mechanisms to compensate people for sequestering carbon, or reforesting and whatever, but we really have to find ways to reward the people who are doing it, and have been doing it for centuries and have been doing it way better than I don't know, than we've done with Western science. I don't know if that's the right term, but
yeah. No, but there
yeah.
is, you're bringing up something that I've seen. There is this marriage of traditional knowledge and modern science, and modern media and storytelling. And so, I've worked with a number of indigenous communities, primarily in Central and South America, but I'm sure this is happening globally. It's just where my experience lies, who are using modern storytelling. So young indigenous people who know how to tell a story visually. Oral traditions and storytelling is part of it. But now they're using, video cameras and drones, and they're documenting their stories. They're also documenting things like deforestation and pollution of their waters and so forth, and getting their messages out there, and really sophisticated. It's not like the equivalent of a chalk drawing on a cave wall. These are really sophisticated storytelling techniques, which is exciting, as well as using satellite imagery to track what's happening on their lands, and camera traps to find people who are doing things illegally and so forth. And so this kind of marriage of traditional knowledge, modern science, and modern storytelling, it's kind of it's powerful. And I think that's really important, because that's beginning to gain attention. And but the real question is, how do we get to a place where we're affecting change on a greater scale, right? That's
Yeah.
the tough part. But I don't know. I feel like what I do, and I wonder if you have a similar feeling, is I you can only work with so many communities. So I'm trying to affect a change in the way that I can by working with the people who I work with, and helping them tell their stories and get their stories out to the world. And as I described perhaps earlier, it's sort of emblematic of what's happening elsewhere, because we can't be everywhere all at once. We can only work in a handful of places at a time. And you've become a specialist in one part of the world, but you work other than in Brazil, but that's primarily where your work takes place. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
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 I mean,
Yeah.
so you mentioned that people ask you about hope, and I pointed to the protagonists in my film are the people who give me hope, because against insurmountable change, seemingly insurmountable change, they created positive change in the world. And as I say, I see that every year. 6 Goldman Environmental Prize winners. There are another, probably 25 who didn't receive the prize, who could have, right? But there's only 6 prizes every year. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, doing positive work out in the world. But we tend to hear about the other stories, right? It's not so much those stories being brought to the fore. And it just seems that that's really important, to give people information about what's happening, give them tools, and encourage them to get involved. And when people ask, how can I get involved? Not everyone has the ability to go to the Amazon or to go to Central America or what have you. But there are ways to be involved, be that writing letters to your representatives in the government about things that you do and don't want to see happening. And letter writing campaigns actually do matter. Our representatives pay attention to that. It's so rare that they get letters. And people making donations. I mean, certainly the people in my films all have organizations that need support. And so, if you go to the website for my film, Water for Life, you'll find ways that you can help the protagonists. On your end, are there ways that people can support the work that's being done that you do, or with the communities or other organizations that you work with?
Yeah, well, my institution, the Woodwell Climate Research Center, has a lot of resources on its website. We work very closely with local partners everywhere that we work. So work very closely with the Instituto de Pesquisa Ambiental da Amazônia, IPAM, the Amazon Environmental Research Institute. So those are 2 places that I would start, and they both have very rich websites that can take you down all sorts of paths depending on your interest. So I would recommend those.
That's great.
And yeah, I mean, I just want to thank you for making this film. I agree that these 3 stories were really, really powerful, and they gave me hope. And I think that is really what we need to kind of keep going. So I appreciate the storytelling. I appreciate the connection to impact campaigns, and to kind of how you can help going forward. And I appreciate the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, me too, very much. And I admire the work that you're doing and that Woods Hole in general, but specifically what you're doing, and appreciate that we had that connection from from the moment we met. And I began talking about how hydroelectric is seen as a clean, green alternative, but there's also a downside to hydro. And you said, so you understand something about these challenges, right? And I'm going to ask you before this is a natural place to sign off, but I would like to ask you, because you're more the scientist than I am, to give a thumbnail sketch of why hydro isn't always the clean, green alternative, if that's possible, because I think I can't just drop that bomb and then not talk about it.
Well, I've been doing a lot of work to understand, not large scale hydro, because there's been some work done on that, but these little tiny dams that are about the size of a beaver dam in agricultural areas, which are not regulated at all. And there are millions of them in the landscape. And we just recently have satellite imagery that's like high enough resolution to map these, but there's many, many, many. And what they do is, one, they warm streams, headwater streams that are very sensitive, right? They're normally 24 degrees C, 24/7, nicely shaded by trees on the riparian zone. The reservoir will open up that forested area and just have this open pan that absorbs solar radiation and warms the water, and that can affect the food web in all sorts of ways. It also creates a low oxygen environment that is really favors methane producing microbes. And so instead of producing CO2 through respiration, they'll produce methane. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, about 30 times more powerful than CO2. It's less long-lived in the atmosphere, but so this is an important source of greenhouse gases. So not necessarily a clean solution in terms of carbon. And it has all sorts of negative consequences for freshwater ecosystems. Yeah, and I mean, in some scenarios also kind of geopolitical problems, right? Because a big dam will allow you to hold water and kind of mess up the flow of water downstream for countries downstream, ecosystems downstream, and let water go when too much water goes through and kind of flood ecosystems and villages downstream, for example. So they're complicated. They definitely are a big change to the environment, and I think the trick to dealing with them is, or I guess the wicked problem of dealing with these dams is that they are kind of they're considered, their environmental impact is considered on a case-by-case basis, and we don't really have a framework for considering cumulative effects, and they do have big cumulative effects. So one dam is bad, 500,000 dams is very, 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 very bad, and like we don't have a way to kind of like know when is enough, and that's true for a lot of problems. I mean, deforestation, I think mining is if you look at the satellite images of mining as it kind of permeates through the landscape in the Amazon, it kind of has a similar feel of like lots of individuals making decisions that seem rational at their scale, but when you multiply them by many, many individuals, it becomes irrational and kind of in everybody's in nobody's self-interest, I should say. Yeah. So
yeah, that's great. Thank you. Really well described and giving it context. And I guess I want to end by giving this context, right? Because I've heard people say, when I give my version of the description of why hydroelectric is not always as clean and green as we might think, I hear back, well, but what do you want? You don't want us burning carbon. You don't, right? You don't want us using petroleum. What are the options? What are we going to do? Because we all live in a world where, we use metal. We all have mobile phones. We all are consuming more. We all need to drive and have our own car, and all of these things in a consumer culture in which we live, an industrialized culture. It kind of points back to the idea, and this is antithetical to our culture and to our economic system, but we all need to be consuming less. And that's kind of the bottom line, right? And it's interesting, early on in the environmental movement, there was a book written, I can't remember the name of the couple, I don't know if you remember this, called Sustainable Futures. And it was early on talking about how we were over consuming and we needed to change our mindset. And they began talking about also population growth. And we need to look at that. And that's totally come off the table. And no one talks about population growth anymore. And the idea of that is part of the problem. And so, you know, these are big issues that we all have to look at, and like it or not, we are creating these sort of destructive changes to our planet and to the future for our children. So I just want to encourage, you know, anyone watching this video today and our film and tracking the work that Marcia and I are doing, to just think about that and think about the future for your children and grandchildren. And if you don't have a family, I don't have children, you know, think about the world from that kind of a compassionate place, and how we can all play some kind of a role in consuming less, holding our government and corporations to higher standards, and trying to take action on something that matters to us in our own world, in our own backyard. And it can be something really simple, but I encourage you to be involved and have an opinion about it, and share that with people who matter to you in your life.
Couldn't agree more.
So thanks to Woods Hole for hosting us, and thanks for screening Water for Life. I was honored to be there and screening the film, and honored to have the film screening now, and to have Marcia joining me here in this conversation. So it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.